Hi everyone, Shane Stevenson, Director of Museum Collections Curator here at the Buffalo Naval Park. And for today's video, I'm going to be talking about the oil and water lab that was on board USS Little Rock. Now, in kind of a fun way, or a fun fashion, I guess, one of our superintendents was from Buffalo, served aboard the USS Little Rock, and that was his space. So he served, his name was Dick Smith, Boiler Tech 3rd Class, and he manned the oil and water space along with 5 other crew, so they had a 24-hour rotation. That space was, the person in charge of that space was Petty Officer 1st Class, so an E6. So while Dick Smith served aboard from 69 to 73, then he moved back home to Buffalo, and he became the 2nd superintendent of the Buffalo Naval Park after Marvin Curry, who also was from Buffalo and had served aboard the USS Little Rock. So really, when I called Dick Smith to talk a little bit about this video, thankfully it wasn't a long-distance phone call. It was a local call. As I mentioned, it's oil and water lab. So I am standing in the evaporator room, and this is where we will start. I think my coworker and I, Brendan, did a video here before the capsizing of the Sullivans in April of 2022. So I think you can find that video on our YouTube channel. So a 20,000 gallon second effect evaporator, same here, 20,000 gallons 2 effect, second effect evaporator. They would bring water in from the sea, they would boil it, purify it, run it through a second time, that's why it's a second effect, run it through twice, and then they would take it to the lab and test it for purity. Alright, they would build the samples here. Alright, and then the samples themselves would then be carried, and we'll head that way. We'll head forward from here. Alright, so it's kind of counterintuitive that the 2 types of water, feed water and fresh water, the feed water would go to the machinery and the boilers. The fresh water would be used for activities of daily living for the humans on board. And counterintuitively, the feed water for the machinery and the boilers needed to be more pure than the water for the humans. Alright, they were able to have a little higher salt content in the water for the fresh water and the activities of daily living. So the sample would be brought here on the 3rd deck, and they would be brought into the oil lab and water lab, which is right here. So Dick had said that when he left in 1973, they changed some things around in here because they went from the special fuel oil to a distillate oil, which was a little bit cleaner and clearer. And so that changed kind of the configuration of this space. He had mentioned that on the forward bulkhead and the after bulkhead, those were gauges to watch the pressure. All right, water pressure gauges to the feed and the fresh water tanks. All right, and they wanted to keep it at about 45 to 50 pounds per square inch. All right, and then they would sound an alarm if it went above that. This might be an example of an alarm that I'm going to talk about in a minute. All right, so they had a centrifuge, and if they were testing the oil, they would add like a distillate or a thinning oil, and then that would separate out while the centrifuge was spinning, and then they were really able to test it, and they had to keep copious notes. All right, outside here is, to my understanding, a transfer panel. All right, so they were able to close and open valves. They had a red and a green light, open and closed. They were able to open and close valves to transfer. There's a cutout. There's a suction. Now they would have suction piping at the bottom of the oil tanks that would be able to, suck oil out. There's a bilge suction here. And the others, the nameplates are gone, unfortunately. Here's one. Cutout to main boiler number 2. So they were able to take oil and from ballast tanks and oil from oil tanks and fuel tanks and transfer them from tank to tank using this system. Right, and that's what Dick Smith was telling me when we were on the phone. We also have an alarm panel here as well. So not only for the water pressure, but you have receiving indicator tank levels, right, and then high level alarms. Right, so these alarms would be attached to here, right? And these alarms could be sounded if it says high level alarm, right? For the tanks in shaft alley, for the tanks in fire room 2, for the tanks in engine room 2, tanks in engine room 1, and again tanks in shaft alley. All right, so if there was a problem going on in the tanks themselves, these gauges would read that, and then they would notify. They would pass that communication through the ship and the channels to take care of it, either to bleed some off or to suction it out through the suction pipes. They always had to do hourly checks, right, on the all of the tankage, and then they would come back here and compute all of those numbers and all of that data. They did have, he said that they kept plexiglass on here with, and there he did it because he worked here, BT3 Smith. Right, they would have plexiglass along the framing of the door here, and where they would keep the daily charts and the hourly checks. Now the boiler techs would also be in charge of the lines for discharging when they went into port, bringing water on board. So not discharging, but bringing water on board. And also for placing during an underway replenishment, that they would have to place the adapters on the hoses, all right, to bring fuel on board. So they would always have to bring fresh water on board when they were in port. That was one of their duties, and then also again to change the adapters on the fuel lines during an underway replenishment. Yeah, so let me see my notes. Well, they would also have to clean the oil tanks. So I asked him what would happen if some of the water, or I'm sorry, some of the oil wasn't pure enough. All right, they brought some of the oil, they say they had an underway replenishment, they filled the tanks, they transferred them from tank to tank, and then they brought some of the oil here for testing for purity. And what if it wasn't pure enough? Well, they would have a stripping line, he called it a stripping line and a stripping pump, and they would be able to pump that contaminated fuel oil either right into the ocean or the sea, depending on where they were, especially back then, or they would transfer it to one of the CHT tanks where then it could be offloaded when they went back into a port of call or came back to America or something, depending on where they were on that particular cruise. So they were able to strip the tank and then bring in other fuel into that particular tank after it was stripped and suctioned out. Now what I found here was, as he was mentioning, these are the pressure gauges for the freshwater tanks. And I saw this looks like an alarm, somewhat. There is no plate on it, alright. I looked around, I don't see any plate on it. But just for whatever, I turned the power on. And it actually begins to whirl. So I might ask him what that is when I talk to him again. I'm wondering if that was one of the alarms, because it certainly looks attached to this control box here, up, and over. So I don't see one over here, although there's the guts of something over here. So again, this space would test all of the oil that was brought on board, or that was already on board, either through an unrep or ones that they would fill in when they were leaving port. And they also tested the water from the evaporators in here. Again, he said about 6 guys worked in here, all boiler techs 3rd class, and they would do a rotation. And because they had to do the feed lines and the freshwater tanks, that they were usually the last ones to have liberty, because they would have to tie up the water lines and the sewer lines to pier side before they were able to actually go on liberty. He also joked that even though the barber shop is about 15 feet forward from here, they were always so busy that they just were never able to get any haircuts. So I hope you enjoyed this little look at the oil and water lab on board. Please leave comments, questions, of course, things like that. I'd like to do a little more research, especially into that potential alarm back there. Okay, hope you enjoyed, and we'll, of course, see you again soon.